Vandy Bono here. Let's get into question 14, which is the third of our three in a row marathon questions. And this one is the very longest, with 16. That's right, 16 articles. We are going to do this in three parts. We're going to take the biggest chunk today, articles 1 through 6, and then the next two videos will have 5 articles apiece. So, here we go. We're in the treatise on the one God, but we get to finally go down here to our last entry, the divine operations. And we are looking at God's knowledge for the first, let's see, 6 questions? 5 questions? No, I'm sorry, I'm not doing well with math there. That'd be 5 questions, right? 14 through 18. Yeah, theology, not math. You gotta stick to your strong points. Okay. God's knowledge. We're looking at these first 6 articles. Whether there is knowledge in God. Article 2, the God as a emo 13-year-old. Does God understand himself? It's always kind of funny how some of these get worded. And you just picture like God as this angry 13-year-old. No one understands me. Or maybe that's just me. Anyway, moving along. Does God comprehend himself? Whether the act of God's intellect is his substance. Yeah, we're going to get nice and dense again, and if your brain hurts half as much as I did going through this, you'll be doing quite well. And then whether God knows things other than himself, and then whether God knows things other than himself by proper knowledge. It's kind of a nice little spoiler there for Article 5, because if the answer was no, we probably wouldn't have an Article 6. Anyway, let's get right into it. Is there knowledge in God? Knowledge is a habit, and habits don't exist in God since they are the means from potential to action. So from potency to action, habits are that which transforms potency to action. Science is knowledge caused by conclusion, and here we have to think of science more in the pre-modern sense, not so much as referring to the scientific method. Nothing is caused in God. And then all knowledge is universal or particular. Excuse me, and there's nothing universal or particular in God, as we saw in question 3, as a result of him not being part of any genus. But Paul refers to the knowledge of God in the book of Romans. Okay, the distinction between non-intelligent and intelligent beings is that the former possesses only their form, while the latter possesses their own form and the forms of what they know. To know something is to possess its idea or form. So basically what that's saying is that when you know something, the no, the form of what you know somehow becomes a part of you. Not in the sense where it's like you're absorbing it in a material sense, but where, you know, to the extent that you know, I'll go back to my friendly water bottle here, to the extent that I know my water bottle, which is a really weird thing to say, but let's just roll with it. The form of this water bottle is in me, you know, and it's not in me perfectly because I couldn't tell you everything about this from, like, I don't know what type of plastic is used here, so I don't know its forms perfectly, but I know it more perfectly as the owner of this water bottle than, say, you do, who is just watching me awkwardly hold it up here on the video. But in both our cases, we have imperfectly this form as a part of us. So the distinction between non-intelligent and intelligent beings is that as intelligent beings, we are capable of knowing something about this water bottle, and by doing so possessing its form. Hence, non-intelligent beings are more limited than intelligent beings. As beings are less constrained by matter, they gain in intelligence, and God is the most immaterial being, and therefore knowledge most perfectly exists in him because he is the most unlimited being. Okay? So this is going to get a little confusing, but we'll just roll with it as best we can. Knowledge is a quality or habit in us because it is imperfect. Since it is perfect in God, it is pure act. There's no transition from potency to act in God's knowledge. It just is all act. Any type of knowledge, such as science, that is divided in us from effect to cause, is united and purely simple in God. And then knowledge exists according to the mode of the knower. God's mode is above the universal or particular, which is what that article that the objection referenced is talking about, and thus knowledge of him is neither universal nor particular, but something beyond both of those. Okay. Does God understand himself? Or does he need to go on a self-discovery expedition? He needs to go travel in Europe, backpack in Europe for a year to find himself. All right. Aristotle says that every knower who knows his own essence returns to his essence. Since God is immutable, he can't return, or go out for that matter, to anything, including his essence. Aristotle says understanding is a kind of passion or movement, and God is wholly immovable. We are most like God in our intellect. Our intellect only understands itself by understanding other things. Therefore, God only understands himself so far as he understands other things. All right. 1 Corinthians 2:11 reassures us that God understands himself. All right, getting to the argument here. We understand or know something by having our senses or intellect be informed of the object we are understanding. It's just a nice philosophical way of making a basic, fairly straightforward statement seem very confusing, right? Since God is wholly simple, his intellect and object are the same in his self-understanding. Therefore, his self-understanding is the divine intellect itself. So, basically what this is saying is that, for God, the fact that he understands himself is a part of his essence, and it must be so because his intellect and his object are the same, being wholly simple, and therefore his intellect fully understands the object of the intellect, mainly himself. All right, I know it's confusing, but God understands himself. That's just, don't worry about God. He's got it covered in the self-discovery category. All right, reply to 1. The idea of returning to one's essence only means that a being becomes self-subsisting, and God is most properly self-subsisting. Therefore, he understands himself. Since for God, self-understanding, his intellect and object are the same, there is no movement in him. And our intellect is to knowledge as primary matter is to material things, potency to act. Since God is pure act, this does not apply to his intellect. So, God understands himself. We're all happy. Does God comprehend himself, though? Uh-oh. A couple objections here. Augustine says that whatever comprehends itself is finite regarding itself, and God is wholly infinite. That would be a problem. If we answer that God is infinite to us, but finite to himself, it can be further objected that everything in God is truer than it is in us. And then, to put those two statements together, we would have to say that it is truer for God to be finite than for him to be infinite, which is nonsense. Okay? Argument from authority. Augustine says that everything that understands itself comprehends itself. So God understands himself. Comprehends himself. Good for God. A thing is comprehended when it is known as perfectly as it is knowable. A thing can be known as far as it is actualized. And you see where we're going here. God's ability to know is as great as his actuality, which is infinite. Therefore, he perfectly comprehends himself. And then, why did I write reply to 3 there? There's only 2 objections. No. Okay. Reply to 2:1. The definition of comprehension Augustine is using means that one thing, the knower, must contain another, the object known. In this sense, God doesn't comprehend himself because that definition requires the object and intellect to be separate, which isn't the case with God. But if we are willing to take that into account with God, he comprehends himself. It's confusing. This is where things just start to get confusing. But God comprehends himself. It's like the basic idea is really straightforward throughout these articles. But then the way that we get there is like the most discursive route possible to arrive at the conclusion, which I mean is great. It's a nice scholastic way, but certainly was tying my brain in knots a bit. Okay, and then when speaking of God's comprehension, we must say he is finite to himself, but that is merely a similitude in order that we may grasp the concept, and we're familiar with that. Whether God's act of intellect or the process by which he understands is also his substance. So God's self-understanding is part of his substance. We saw that in Article 2, but what about his act of self-understanding? Act is an operation, and operation is procession from the substance of the operator. Therefore, the act of God's intellect is not his substance. The act of understanding is something secondary, not great. If God is his act of understanding, he is not great, which is false. And if God is not distinct from his act of understanding, then an infinite regression is created since he understands himself. In other words, we get to he understands, that he understands, that he understands. It just goes on and on to infinity. Augustine says that for God to be is the same as to understand. Since God's existence is his essence, we come back to that question 3, Article 4 yet again. His understanding, meaning his act of understanding, is his essence. To understand is not something distinct from the operator as shown in Article 2. I did not get that out of Article 2, but I'm going to take Aquinas' word for it. Since the act of understanding is in God, it must be his substance, lest it violate his simplicity. Yeah, this is where I started to get confused. I just kind of say, okay, I'll go with it. You're smarter than me, St. Thomas. So I'm not going to argue with you. All right, objections answered. To understand is not a procession, but something inside the operator, which I misspelled. And then, that is true of understanding non-subsistent things, but not of understanding self-subsisting things. Okay. Again, I'll be very honest, I'm a little lost, but we're going to keep rolling. Because the act of divine understanding is self-subsisting, it does not proceed to infinity, because it isn't like, a chicken or egg thing. They're the same thing. So that one I kind of got. All right, sorry, I know, I never claimed to be the perfect teacher of any of this stuff. We're going for basic comprehension. Yeah, and sometimes we even have to scrape and claw our way to get even that far. But we do the best we can. All right, Article 5, whether God knows things other than himself. Augustine says God does not behold things outside of himself. All other things are outside of himself, and he does not, therefore, understand them. The object understood is the perfection of the one who understands. In other words, as we know more things, it perfects us by expanding us, by actualizing a potential in us. So I have, to go back to my water bottle, I have a potential, as do you. You have the potential to know this water bottle. And as you know it, that potential is actualized, which is a perfection in you. So what he's saying then, what the objection is saying, is that because of that, if God knows other things, they are perfecting him, which is false, because nothing besides God, God is wholly perfect and nothing else can perfect him. The act of understanding is specified by the thing understood. God is his act of understanding. Therefore, if he understands other things, they specify him, which is impossible. Didn't quite understand that, but I went with it. Hebrews 4:13 says God knows all things. Hooray. Since the divine power extends to other things as their first cause, and is proof 2, it logically follows. And by the way, I just want to note here that it is kind of cool that, we talked about back when we talked about the 5 proofs, that you can't just look at those in a box and say, this is all Aquinas has to say. And that's a lot of times what people do. If they read any part of the Summa, it's the 5 proofs and that's it. But really, the 5 proofs are kind of this very microcosmic statement that Aquinas keeps expanding on and referencing again and using to say all sorts of other things. It logically follows that he must know other things, since I should have start over. Since the divine power extends to other things as the first cause, logically, yeah, okay. Further, as the first cause, all things pre-exist in him, as any effect pre-exists as cause. We've seen that before. Nevertheless, it must be specified that God sees others through seeing himself. Okay? Augustine means that God does not see outside himself except through seeing himself, as explained above. God understands other things not by their substance, but through himself. Therefore, they are not his perfection, because he's not understanding that he, because, so basically what Aquinas is wanting to affirm is that God similarly to how we talked in question 12, how the blessed see all things, or have the potential to see things, they see them in God, and therefore they see them perfectly. That's how God sees everything, is through himself, through his own perfection. And that's how we're going to get around things like that other things are perfecting him, because no, he's seen through himself. And so it's not that something else is perfecting him, it's that I don't know how to explain it better than that. I'm sorry. All right. Since God sees other things through himself, it does not follow that they specify him, and we'll just say, that's great. I don't understand it. Let's move on. And then whether God knows things other than himself by proper knowledge, whatever that means. Since God knows other things in himself only, he does not know them by proper knowledge. Since the divine essence cannot be known by the created essence, shown in question 12, the inverse is true as well. And that right there should set off some flags and say, yeah, I kind of see where that objection's going wrong. Therefore, God does not have proper knowledge of other things. To know things other than by their proper ratio is to know them generally, not properly. Since God knows things only in himself, he does not know them by their proper ratio. I have no idea what they mean by the proper ratio, and I tried to find it out and couldn't find anything on that. So if you would like to dig into that, you're welcome to, but I was lost on that. All right, to have proper knowledge is to know things as distinct from each other. And Hebrews 4:12 through 13 makes it clear that God knows things in that way. So he doesn't just have this kind of vague general knowledge about things, but he knows you and you and you and me and my water bottle, and all this good stuff, right? God has proper knowledge of everything. To know things generally only is to have an imperfect knowledge of them. That's true. So right there, we've kind of already proved it, because if God's knowledge of other things is imperfect, then he is imperfect, which is impossible, because of question 4 on the perfection of God. Further, since all perfections in creatures are even more perfect in God, he knows them properly through knowing the perfections of their forms. Okay? Again, pretty basic concept. God doesn't just have a general vague knowledge. He knows you, as you, and as far as you can be known. Not just this general sense of humanity or, like that. That's kind of the distinction Aquinas is getting at. All right, even though God knows things in himself, he knows them in their nature and essence. So just because he's seen things in himself doesn't mean that it's somehow clouded for him. No, it's still he understands them perfectly. And then the created essence cannot know the divine essence, since the former is imperfect and the latter perfect, but the inverse is not true, because the issue is perfection, not a mutual unknowability. The divine essence can know the created essence. And then finally, the divine essence can be taken as the proper ratio of all things. Again, no idea what that means. Couldn't find a reference to it. Wasn't in my helpful commentary here from Father Garrigou-Lagrange. So there you have it. But I think we got the big idea. So sorry if I don't have more specificity on this. I usually like to, try and put on the teacher hat a bit more. But some of these I'm just out of my depth on. But nevertheless, we keep plugging away. So next time we'll do articles 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. And tackle the middle part of question 7. But until then, I am Ben DeBon, and I will talk to you later.